guys, Comic Boom here to talk about Jonah Hex, all things Jonah Hex. I'm here to celebrate. I got 150 YouTube subscribers. Can you believe it? I can't believe it. It fluctuates like crazy, but I'm at 150, and I just want to give a shout out to Comic Perch. I put a challenge out on Twitter to anybody crazy enough to be my 150th subscriber, and guess what? I'm at 150. And given my luck, it'll go down to 149 again for a while, but you know how it hovers. But anyways, thank you so much. I want to thank you all for subscribing to my channel. Enough with the violence. Honestly, have a shot. That's good. I cheated. I put a little Coke in the rye, but you know, it's all good. Jonah Hex had his first appearance in All-Star Western number 10. I don't have that issue, but I do have his second appearance in All-Star Western number 11, which I picked up at a Comic-Con. The price tag on it was $40. I think I got it for $25 because I negotiated. I bought other comics, but yeah, it's I'm quite happy with it. Second appearance of Jonah Hex. It's amazing. I'm so happy with that. In Weird Western Tales number 29, which I'm going to be referencing, we get more information on the origin of Jonah Hex, which I'm going to get to, because it's actually quite interesting. These are hard. Jonah Hex has a hard-ass, badass origin. I got to tell you what. This is the first issue of Jonah Hex that DC put out later on. I forget what year it came out in, but it's an April issue, 30 cents on the cover price. Issue 1 of Jonah Hex. The final issue, it went 92 issues. It ended in 1990. Issue 92, I believe it was in 95, 85. Yeah, 1985 was the final issue of Jonah Hex, issue 92. 2006, Jimmy Palmiotti and Justin Gray with this amazing cover. They had a long run on Jonah Hex in 2006. That was during the I believe that was during the well, no, it wasn't the New 52 era. The New 52 was All-Star Western, but this was just look at that cover. That looks like the Clint Eastwood of yore, doesn't it? Beautiful cover. That lasted for a while. All-Star Western came out. The New 52, Jonah Hex was revitalized in the All-Star Western series. During the New 52, this was one of my favorite issues, issue 11, where he basically ends up having adventures in 19th century Gotham City, where he ends up meeting the origins of their version of the Court of Owls that was of Batman fame and dealing with the crime Bible, meeting up with Tallulah Black. He also has adventures with Abadiah Arkham, who ultimately was one of the the founders of Arkham Asylum. This is a fantastic series, highly underrated. I think of all the things of the New 52 that DC did wrong, one of the things they did right in the New 52 was putting Jimmy Palmiotti and Justin Gray on All-Star Western. It was an amazing series, fantastic, one of my favorite. And the art, the cover art was just always amazing. I'll be putting some of this up as well. My favorite character of Jonah Hex is Tallulah Black. Tallulah Black ultimately ends up being his love interest. My favorite all-time cover, Jonah Hex cover, is this one here. It's Jonah Hex cover, issue 28 of All-Star Western. It's the highlight of the for me, because he ends up being trapped in the 21st century. He gets drunk and he drives his motorcycle, gets into an automobile accident and almost dies, and 21st Century Science repairs. They thought that he was so ugly, they thought he got his scars from the accident, and so they fixed them up, and then he actually really did look like Clint Eastwood. and it's just great. This is him in the 21st century, where he interacted with Batman, Bruce Wayne, Superman. It was a great run. The final issue, All-Star Western, issue 34, is one of my personal favorite. It's a lot of people's favorite if you're a Jonah Hex lover, because Darwin Cook drew this entire issue. It's absolutely fantastic. It's the end of the trail for him. As a matter of fact, in Darwin Cook, who's one of my favorite artists, he passed in 2000. I believe he died in 2016. This is Graphic Inc., the DC Comics art of Darwin Cook. in this issue of the End of the Trail, issue 34, is reprinted in its entirety in this beautiful graphic album, all of which representing all of Darwin Cook's work. It is absolutely gorgeous. And one of the things that is very interesting about Jonah Hex, and again, kudos to, God bless to Darwin Cook, the greatest, my favorite artist of all time, living or dead, for all time, Darwin Cook. No one has drawn Jonah Hex better, in my opinion, and there's been some really great artists on him, but I just love Darwin Cook. But in any event, one of the things that always bothered Jimmy Palmiotti and Justin Gray about Jonah Hex was that his origins is how he died. Because in the Jonah Hex Spectacular, which came, I believe that was around 1986, 87, in the Jonah Hex Spectacular, it basically, he had a very, very unglorious death. He actually ended up getting stuffed. It was revealed that he was stuffed, and he was a taxidermist, stuffed Jonah Hex and put him on display in a museum, and he sort of died like sort of a cliche Wild Bill Hickok, shot from behind, killed. Because he was he died at the age of 65 or 66. He was an aging bounty hunter, and he was cowardly killed by someone, and the person who killed him, a wandering carnival had Jonah Hex's body stuffed and put him on display. It was really a terrible way for Jonah Hex to go out. Well, what's fantastic about the End of the Trail here is when Jonah Hex and Tallulah Black when he gets back from the 21st century and he's back in his own time, and he meets up with Tallulah Black again. He actually meets up with the very person who he believes would ultimately end up killing him, because in the future, Jonah Hex discovers and sees his stuffed future self in a museum, and it really depresses him to know that he went out that way. And so he knows something about how his life ends, because he's been to the future. And so when Jonah Hex goes back and talks and meets up with this person who supposedly killed him, he realizes that this person that supposedly killed him, in fact, looks a lot like him. And so it's a real great story where basically they end up killing this guy, him and Tallulah, with the help of Tallulah Black, who he's in love with, and Tallulah Black's in love with him. They basically kill him off, and people think that the person who died was Jonah Hex. It's kind of a predictable story in that sense, but basically it's a wonderful story because Jimmy Palmiotti gives Jonah Hex a happy ending, which is something that you don't expect. You don't expect that in a Jonah Hex story. There are no happy endings in a Jonah Hex story, but this was a happy ending. This was a love letter from Jimmy Palmiotti and Justin Gray to such a fantastic character, and Darwin Cook, whose art was fantastic. I'm going to be showing it here. Absolutely beautiful. At some point, I'm probably going to review in detail this entire issue, but I'll show you shots of it. But to know that Jonah Hex ends up happily sailing off into the sunset with Tallulah Black, and anybody who knows anything about Jonah Hex knows that his relationships don't generally tend to last long, and usually the women that are with him usually end up dead, quite frankly. While Tallulah Black is the most kick-ass, badass woman that he could end up that there is, and beautiful. Even with her scars, Tallulah Black is beautifully rendered. And if I don't think Darwin Cook when he, God bless his soul, I don't think he ever knew how to draw an unattractive woman. And he tried, but he couldn't do that with Tallulah Black. Tallulah Black is beautifully rendered in this issue 34. I encourage you to pick it up. Jonah Hex is not, I don't think Jonah Hex is a particularly super popular character, so if you have an opportunity to pick up some back issues of Jonah Hex, the All-Star Western run of the New 52, please do so, particularly the last 5 or 6 issues from issues 28, 20, well actually the whole damn run's good, but if you can pick up the trades, do so. It's well worth it. I would recommend the individual comics because the cover art alone is well worth the cover price. Beautifully rendered. Jonah Hex is a rough character. He's had a very, very rough history. He was born in 1838, and for the first 10 years of his life, his parents were they were always screwed up. His mother eventually, when he was about 10 years old, basically ran off with a traveling salesman. And for the next 2 years, from the ages of when he was about 10 to about 12, Jonah Hex's dad continued to be a raging alcoholic and repeatedly beat him. Jonah Hex had an extremely abusive childhood. His mother ultimately never cared for him very much, and his dad was a complete jerk and a very physically abusive one. And that was his mindset. So growing up, Jonah Hex very much had a very, very abusive childhood. This is not for the faint of heart. You know, when you look at the early history of Jonah Hex comics, if you actually read between the lines, well, you don't even have to read between the lines. If you read the early issues of Jonah Hex from his early appearances right onward, especially when you read the source material, you really get a sense of just how harsh Jonah Hex's life was. His dad, in a fit of alcoholic stupidity and rage, basically sold him into slavery just to get some cash to probably continue on with his alcoholism. His dad basically sold Jonah Hex, sold his own son to an Apache tribe, just so he could likely further his alcoholic habit. It was really, really bad. Well, basically, Jonah Hex was raised in the Apache tribe. Basically, he was a white kid, so he stood out like a sore thumb. He was always the outcast. There was a lot of, I guess you could consider it reverse racism or whatever. But I mean, he was always like the white man, so he was always used and abused himself, even in the Apache tribe. But the Indians, of course, had their own sort of culture. As he got older, when he was about 16 years of age, about 15, 16 years of age, he ends up saving the chief from an attack by a puma, by an animal or some damn thing, and he got in the good books with the chief, so he was revered. He was welcome to be a formal member of the tribe because he had proven himself. Well, there was another member of the tribe that didn't like Jonah very much. His name was Notante, who grew very jealous. Basically because they both liked the same woman named White Fawn, and ultimately Notante ended up and at a manhood ritual when they were 16 ends up killing Jonah Hex, or he believes he killed Jonah Hex, and leaves Jonah Hex to die. Jonah Hex is ultimately discovered by the U.S. Cavalry, and while he's saved, they end up wiping out the tribe, but Jonah Hex doesn't believe in vengeance. At that time, he never really believed in vengeance, so he didn't want the cavalry to wipe the tribe out, but they did, and they ended up shooting Jonah Hex in the stomach when they tried to prevent him from doing so. And as he got older, he eventually became a member of the U.S. Cavalry. He became a cavalry scout in the U.S. Army. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, Jonah Hex's loyalties were to the South. But Jonah Hex was never a fan of slavery. And this is where we get into the most controversial and troubling aspects and interesting aspects of Jonah Hex's history, because he was part of the Confederacy. That's part of the outfit here. Now, in these troubling times, we all know what's in the news right now, that, nobody likes anything to do with the Confederacy, the Confederate flag, everything else. All the Confederate monuments are coming down. And here we have a character, Jonah Hex, whose costume, it's kind of hard who's very uniform. This guy's never been a mega popular comic book character. Did this guy embrace Confederate ideals? Did he embrace slavery? He did, not at all. In fact, he hates slavery. He was a slave himself to the Apaches. And he said he has such a complex origin when you look at it from just a basic psychological point of view, what this kid must have gone through. He was a slave through most of his life. He was ostracized and hated by his own parents, sold by his dad into slavery to an Apache tribe. The Apaches, from the ages of when he was 12 to when he was about approximately 15, so at least 3 to 4 years of being a slave to the Apaches. He eventually wins over the Apaches by the fact that he's willing to sacrifice himself to save the life of the chief. He earns his place in every sense of the term. This is a hero's journey in every sense of the term. There's no SJWism in Jonah Hex, let me tell you. Okay? This is a guy who's earned it, and he went through hell, and he went through everything you can imagine. And so he hates slavery, but he ends up, the very Apache tribe that raised him, for the most part, is more or less, they're pretty much wiped out. I'm oversimplifying this. There are some members that survived, but for the most part, they were wiped out. He ends up becoming a member of the U.S. Cavalry as a cavalry scout. Civil War breaks out in 1861, and he ends up with a best friend. He meets a guy by the name of Jeb Turnbull, and Jeb Turnbull's father is Quentin Turnbull. Now, if the Quentin Turnbull sounds familiar, it's because Quentin Turnbull ultimately ends up being the archenemy of Jonah Hex. But early on, that's not how it started out. Quentin Turnbull is a plantation owner. He owns, in the South End, he owns a lot of slaves. And he's kind of your typical slave owner like they were back then. And from early on, Jonah Hex was not a fan of slavery. He was always uncomfortable with the fact that his best friend, Jeb Turnbull, that his dad was a slave owner, but he believed in friendship, and there was a lot of things about the South that he loved, but he was very uncomfortable with the concept of slavery. So in 1862 comes around, or around 1862 is 63 with the Emancipation Proclamation, Abraham Lincoln basically proclaimed all slaves to be free, at least for the purposes of joining the military. Jonah Hex, he could no longer fight for the South, but at the same time, he didn't want to fight against his brothers, who he loved in the South. So he decided he was going to surrender himself to the Union Army and not fight at all. He would spend the rest of the war years, however long the Civil War would last. If he had to be a prisoner of war, he didn't care. He basically was surrendering himself to the Union Army. He didn't want to fight. He was too uncomfortable. Slavery made him too uncomfortable. And he didn't want to fight against his brothers in the South. So he surrenders himself to the Union Army. But the guy who he surrenders himself to wants Jonah Hex to reveal where his fellow soldiers are. He refuses to do so. But here's the irony, and this is some of the great storytelling. This was told in Jonah Hex number 29. When he surrenders himself to the Union Army, there are blacks that are actually part of the Union Army themselves. And ironically enough, it's one of the black members of the Union Army that is very, very intelligently looks at Jonah Hex's boots, and it's a particular type of clay, and it's a black soldier in the Union Army that determines where Jonah Hex came from, and they traced it back to it was sort of like in early days of CSI. They traced it back to where the Confederate Army was, and they captured all of Jonah Hex's unit, and Jonah Hex's Confederate friends basically blamed Jonah Hex for betraying them, even though he didn't. It was, ironically enough, it was a black Union soldier who, in trying to get into the good books with his Union captain, that actually contributed to the downfall of Jonah Hex in the eyes of his Confederate friends. Ultimately, it turned out that the captain that Jonah Hex surrendered himself to deliberately made an example out of Jonah Hex. He was a complete jerk. He thanked Jonah Hex in front of his men for giving him the information that they needed to capture the Confederate soldiers, when in fact Jonah did not do that, but he did that just to be an asshole. And Jonah Hex retaliated by punching the Union captain, and of course he was jailed for that. And while he was incarcerated, he discovered an escape route, an underground tunnel that was deliberately placed there, intentionally meant to be discovered by Jonah Hex, and it was all part of a scheme by the captain of the Union Army to basically have Jonah Hex try to escape with the Confederate soldiers so he could kill them all. And as it turned out, that's exactly what they did. They as the Confederate soldiers were trying to escape at the encouragement and being led by Jonah Hex, they were all wiped out. There was very few survivors, and Jonah Hex always had a bad reputation in the few people who survived. It was called the Charlottetown's Massacre, the massacre at Charlottetown in Jonah Hex lore. And basically that put Jonah Hex in a very bad eyes in the eyes of his Confederate soldiers. And so he was always looked down upon after that, even though it really wasn't his fault. Jonah Hex ultimately retaliated. He kills the captain who did all that, and then he basically went on and ultimately ended up going back to the Apache tribe that betrayed him, the Apache chief, and basically told on no tante, and ended up killing no tante in a battle, because when he told the chief of what Notante had done and how he had betrayed him, and Notante tried to kill him, the manhood ritual when he was 16. Ultimately, he had to prove himself again, and he defeated Notante, but unfortunately, he ended up killing him through a crazy sequence of events. And as punishment for violating the rules of that particular trial by combat, he was scarred, and that's how Jonah Hex got his scars. He was actually scarred by the very Apache tribe that had essentially helped raise him into adulthood. And subsequent to that, he became a bounty hunter and was trained by one of the best gunslingers in the West, whose name eludes me right now, but it's unimportant. What particularly stands out about Jonah Hex is just how tragic a figure he is. That this is a conflicted figure, that he goes on with his life continuing to wear the Confederate soldier's uniform. Even after the Civil War ended, he continued to wear Confederate clothing, even though it was, for many people in the West, I guess you could say in the North, so to speak, was associated negatively with slavery. The fact is, Jonah Hex realized something. He knew that evil exists in men's heart, and it has nothing to do with North and South. The fact of the matter is, Jonah Hex's best friends were in the South, and so he wore the Confederate soldiers to respect them. And he didn't care that he knew he was against slavery, but he knew that what you were against wasn't defined by the clothes that you wore. It was defined by your actions and what you do. And one of the things he discovered when he surrendered himself to the Union Army is that the Union captain was just as racist and just as hateful toward the blacks, Union soldiers, as any Confederate leader was, or any plantation owner was. The only difference was they just hid it better. And that's one of the hypocrisies that Jonah Hex saw early on. He saw that evil lurks in the hearts of men, in what they do and in what they say. And what the law says is very different than how men actually act. And that's the code of Jonah Hex, that he judges you by your actions. He protects the innocent, and he doesn't care what the law is, Jonah Hex. That's why he's an outlaw. He's a bounty hunter. He does what has to be done in order to get the bad guys in. But Jonah Hex repeatedly will break whatever laws are necessary in order to bring vengeance and to do what is right. And that's what makes Jonah Hex such a compelling character, because he did so at a time when it was very easy for people to continue to live in their lives in total and complete hypocrisy. Because that's exactly what America was in post-Civil War years and during the Civil War. The North was just as racist and prejudiced as the South was. The only difference was that, you know, they were a little bit, there was other vested interests in order to be against slavery, but there was also other interests and other reasons for the Civil War that were economically based, not just slavery based. And this is stuff that it's more complex than that. And there's complexity in the early issues of Jonah Hex that I would strongly encourage anyone to get. If you have an opportunity to pick up a showcase issues or any trade with Jonah Hex, particularly ones, the early issues are really good. Jimmy Palmiotti and Justin Gray are really good at it, at really drawing out the complexity of Jonah Hex as he roams the American landscape in the late 19th century, doing what needs to be done. And he was a bounty hunter until his late years. And kudos to Jimmy Palmiotti and Justin Gray, who in issue 34 of Jonah Hex, as I've mentioned before, give Jonah Hex the type of escape from that crazy bounty hunter life that he had by allowing him to sail off into the sunset with Tallulah Black at the prime of his life, having just returned from the 21st century and his adventures against the Court of Owls, Vandal Savage, adventures with Batman, with Superman, and basically coming back to the 19th century and obtaining some type of closure and bringing some peace and love into his life by bringing love into Tallulah Black's life, who, like him, Tallulah Black was like the female version of Jonah Hex, had a very tumultuous, very violent life, was raped, mutilated, her child killed, her unborn child died, killed, and Jonah Hex was always there for her. Jonah Hex finds love with Tallulah Black, and he finds redemption, and he finds peace. Finally, in issue 34 of Jonah Hex, All-Star Western. We have not really had a Jonah Hex story since then. other than his adventure with Yosemite Sam, also written by Jimmy Palmiotti, and that was with the Looney Tunes issue that came out last year. Wasn't bad. It was typical Jonah Hex. I encourage you to get it, but it's still not as great as Jimmy Palmiotti's run. But it was a nice little sort of homage to Jonah Hex and Yosemite Sam. Before the Age of Heroes, in the 20th century, or the 21st century, I guess now. Before the Age of Heroes, there was Jonah Hex. And I always think that, you know, if anyone ever attacked the DC universe in the 19th century, who would protect the planet? You'd have to look to Jonah Hex. He was the only one there, really. He was before the Justice Society. That was the guy, and he was awesome, and he was badass. He was what he needed to be. He is the protector that America needed in the 19th century, because he wasn't afraid to cross the lines that needed to be crossed in order for ultimately better times to prevail. That's why I love Jonah Hex, and that's why you guys should pick up anything Jonah Hex that you can get your hands on. Guys, thank you so much for enduring me on this. I love Jonah Hex. Please hit the subscribe button. Feel free to follow me on Twitter. I'm at Comic Boom on Twitter. Have a great day, guys, and in celebration of Jonah Hex, don't be afraid to, you know, have a little bit of Crown Royal and maybe even shoot it back. And if you have to, well, just drink it straight from the bottle. That's fine, too. All right? So, until we meet again, Comic Boom, out.